Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll start with talking to Stewart a bit about Next Chapter.
So Next Chapter is a program to create apprenticeships and ultimately full-time positions for formerly incarcerated people. And this is something that we developed internally at Slack, but now we have a number of partners. Dropbox, Square, and Zoom are some examples, and bringing more people on. So this is not a scalable solution to the general problem of finding employment and opportunities for formerly incarcerated people. This is one little niche, but it's creating real jobs, the actual software engineering jobs at an actual tech company where people have actual stock options. And the result of that, I think, is pretty profound, not just on the people in the program, but on their network, on their friends, on their families. And ultimately, I think that's one of the intentions, and there's a whole bunch, but one of the intentions from my perspective, just given the enormous amount of wealth creation and the opportunities that exist inside companies like Slack, we wanted to ensure that there was access for a whole bunch of people, because the people will pull in their networks.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about all of that in a little bit more depth. But first, let's bring Kenyatta into this conversation. It's great to have you with us here. Kenyatta, can you just tell us a bit about your path and how you got involved with this effort, now leading Next Chapter for Slack?
Sure. I come into this work through my own incarceration. I was incarcerated for 20 plus years in the California prison system. Most recently for being an ex-felon in possession of a firearm. I worked really hard while I was in prison to turn my life around, got involved in a bunch of programs. One notable program being the Last Mile program, which is a software development training program inside. Helped start that program there. And through my participation in the Last Mile, I was released from prison in 2013. And through my participation in the Last Mile, I earned an internship. Worked there for about 5 years, a company called Rocket Space. And then I joined the Last Mile team in 2018 as a reentry manager, helping folks, return back to the community. And, the work has just been really super fulfilling for me. Obviously, I received a lot of support, to help me turn my life around. And so to be able to help other people do the same thing is, a blessing.
That's terrific. And Kenyatta, can you just speak a bit more from that personal experience? We all know the horrible statistics about recidivism, which speaks to just how little support so many formerly incarcerated people have when they're reentering civilian life. Can you talk about the importance of a job? Now, a job at Slack is great, but just that stable job as a stepping stone to really a productive reentry to society. How important is it?
Oh, it's critically important. I think having a job for anyone, let alone somebody coming out of prison, is critically important, to being able to survive in this world out here. But for people who are coming home, having a job, having financial stability is super important. Having resources to be able to find housing, clothing, food, just the basic necessities that we need in life is really important. Without that, the chances of recidivism increase dramatically. I think there's been a ton of studies on that. Within the first 3 years, if people don't have gainful employment, the recidivism rates go up. And so we found that, the folks that we work with, they're really excited about having these opportunities to work. And, we're just trying to create more of them.
Thank you for sharing that, Kenyatta. Stewart, can you tell us about where this program came from? Because I got to believe you got a bunch of things going on as the CEO of a fast-growing company. How is it that you came to be involved in this issue and ultimately help get Next Chapter going?
I think the initial spark of awareness comes from someone who's had a big influence on a lot of people, Brian Stevenson. And I heard him speak at a conference 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. And the Slack holiday gift for employees that year included a copy of his book, Just Mercy. And obviously something that I highly recommend to anyone. I had some kind of loose, broad interest without a lot of knowledge around criminal justice reform for a long time. But this really catalyzed it for me. And I think as an indirect result of that, I ended up going to San Quentin to visit people in the program that Kenyatta was just talking about, The Last Mile. And it was just really incredible to see, because there was people I met there. And in fact, three of the people I met on this trip ended up working at Slack much later. But here are people in prison and learning how to be software developers, and they're not allowed access to the internet. So, a solid third of software development is Googling stuff to figure out what you're supposed to do, and they don't have that. A lot of people were designing apps who had never, really experienced the smartphone life revolution that happened because they had been incarcerated the whole time. People making stuff for Facebook who had never actually used Facebook. So it's just really impressive, kind of the ingenuity.
Yeah. Kenyatta, can you speak to this both from your perspective as someone who's gone through this personally, but also through your work with Last Mile and Next Chapter? I think it's one thing for people to imagine, just how difficult it will be to serve time and then try to re-enter, but then to know that there are these structural impediments that are preventing them from actually getting these jobs, which you correctly said were so important. Just how big are these impediments, and what needs to be changed to make it easier for people to get those jobs and really re-enter and have these productive lives?
This is a huge problem that we face, and it really revolves around a lot of the stuff that Brian Stevenson speaks to around justice. When we take a look at the system, the way it's aligned against people who are formerly incarcerated, there's a really big stigma there that people have to overcome. It's a big challenge to have to make the paradigm shift from an incarcerated setting into a corporate world or a tech environment. But when you have this stigma that's associated with that, like Stewart had mentioned, what kind of crime was this person involved in? That's a huge hurdle to get over. And these stigmas really revolve around fear. And our program is in large part constructed to help dismantle a lot of those fears. And the talk that Ali gave with Stewart is a big part of that, humanizing folks, bringing the humanity back into the equation. People that go to prison are just that, they're people. And it's important for us to really focus on the potential that people have. I mean, we've come up with 1,000 ways to make sure that this plastic bottle gets a new life, but far too few to make sure that somebody getting out of prison does, right? And so what we're trying to do is double down and really focus on people's potential and how can we build that. And at the same time, change the narrative, shift the narrative about, what people coming out of prison are capable of. I talk to people every single day, and most people would never, think that I had been to prison. But, when you get to talk to people and you get to, really see who people are and what they're capable of, it really makes a difference. And we've gotten a ton of support from the folks at Slack. It's been a challenge to overcome some of those fears there. But when you think about it, when you go through a process of overcoming a fear, if you've ever had somebody help you through a process of overcoming a fear, that change is really long lasting and those relationships run deep. And we've been really fortunate to have that kind of support at Slack, people that really want to roll up their sleeves and really address these systemic issues that we see today. And we're fortunate to have that, and we look forward to doing a lot more of this work in the future.
Kenyatta, when you think about what you would like to see from other companies, what is your call to action for corporate America right now when it comes to working with the formerly incarcerated, and what you can point to that is possible through a program like Next Chapter?
Well, I think it's important for to create space to have these kind of conversations, right? I think that Stewart bringing somebody like Ali Tambura to Slack to have a conversation around the issue of criminal justice reform is a big deal, right? So creating space to have these kind of conversations, a safe place where people can ask questions that they normally might not ask. I also think that, that's just one point where folks can get proximate, but I do think that there's other ways that folks can get proximate to the issues as well, too. Stewart had mentioned, that there are folks that from Slack that actually went to San Quentin and actually met people at the prison. that goes a long way, right? So getting proximate, creating space, and I think just being bold, having the courage to take this step to overcome the fear that's associated with the stigmas around people who are formerly incarcerated. To me, those are three just critical steps that need to be taken if anyone wants to get involved in this kind of work. And I would also include call next chapter. We're happy to help.
There you go. And Stewart, you identified a lot of the very real obstacles to getting something like this done inside a company, from employee resistance to regulatory challenges. Given all of that, why is it worth it? Why should companies actually spend, precious time, energy, resources on this issue of all the ones out there?
Part of it, I think, has to come internally from people. So there's what is the saying? Something like we should judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable people. I think it seems like a Christian belief, but it also seems like something that has a broad appeal to anyone who's not Christian. It's just like it's a great principle. And while there is employee uncertainty, the broad base of employees were very enthusiastic about this. And I think that the uncertainty was something to be overcome. But as Kenyatta just mentioned, we've literally had hundreds of people at this point go out to San Quentin, and I think about over 100 employees involved in some way with the Next Chapter program, and that can be working with the people in their apprenticeships to kind of tutor, give supplemental skills, kind of almost like social etiquette lessons on corporate life, because a lot of people just had no exposure to office jobs before. And I think it's worth it ultimately because we have to take a pretty broad spectrum approach to, I was going to say combating inequality, but I don't think that's quite the right. Combating is not the right word for it. Certainly, over the last year since the pandemic, we've seen just an enormous exacerbation of of existing problems, and I don't think it's good for society, good for anyone. But I think it's also just it's tough for people who have the kind of the luck, the privilege, the luxury to shut off the part of their mind or their soul that would make them feel, like a lot of shared personhood with the people who are not so lucky. But I think we created a lot more of those people. So when I mentioned before that we're trying to take a pretty broad experimental approach, the Next Chapter is one of those experiments, and I think it's one that worked out really well. And the reason I think it's worth it is because we're going to see another generation of people who go on to become leaders in other companies, to start their own companies, who bring their friends and family and their networks more broadly into the industry, and create a series of opportunities that really knocks down walls and kind of spreads out more widely. So the last thing I would say is I think the net impact on employees is a lot of pride. It creates an opportunity for them to contribute, to volunteer, and I think just inspires them to look at other places in their life where they could make a difference. I'd forgotten about this, but in the early days of the pandemic, Kenyatta got an opinion piece in USA Today that was like lessons I learned from San Quentin that are applicable to people in the lockdown. And one of the principal points he mentioned was purpose. I mean, people, maybe especially in times of uncertainty, but people need to feel like there is some purpose to their life and their activity. And giving a broader base of employees some sense of that, I think is really powerful, impactful. It creates a better culture, it creates a lot of morale, it creates a lot of enthusiasm, tighter bonds, more trust, all the things that I think that leaders are trying to cultivate anyway.
And Kenyatta, you know this population as well as anyone, both personally and now professionally. What's the lost opportunity cost? If the corporate America and the rest of society doesn't fulsomely engage the formerly incarcerated in a country that has a higher incarceration rate per capita than any other developed nation in the world, what are we missing? What are we going to lose?
We just lose on all levels. I think first and foremost, what comes to mind is people, we have millions and millions of people who are, just ostracized and can't find work because because of their background. I think the Kellogg Foundation did a study not long ago where they show that there's like so much money that's being left on the table, GDP that's being left on the table because we're not putting people to work. And that's just a shame. We can do better. And I think there's a lot of, and when you think about that and how that impacts people in the home, this becomes a revolving door where people don't get work, they go back to prison, people lose hope, families are broken. We as taxpayers pay, extraordinary amounts of money for a system that's broken. And so we can do much, much better. I think that, we have the resources. We just need the courage, to take these steps. I think Next Chapter is providing a great example of what that looks like. But as Stewart mentioned earlier, it's a drop in the bucket. And we need to have more examples like this to help continue to move the needle in the right direction.
Well, keep up the good work, Kenyatta. Stewart, as we wrap it up, talk to us about what this program is going to look like going forward. Slack has obviously agreed to be acquired by Salesforce. I know through decades of covering mergers and acquisitions that cultures can change. What assurances have Mark Benioff of Salesforce, the company Salesforce, given you about the ability for Slack to continue and maybe even expand a program like Next Chapter?
Well, we haven't been through every detail, but Salesforce has had for a number of years trust as one of its principal values, and more recently, equality. So, I think this is something that's very much in alignment with the publicly stated values of Salesforce, but also what they talk about internally. The deal hasn't closed yet, so there's still a lot for me to learn. But one of my hopes is that we can help scale it. That we're, I think, 2,600 employees or something like that, and Salesforce is 55,000, so it's a much bigger company. And when we talk about the future more broadly, I'd just love to get more companies participating. And the group that's participating so far, obviously, us, Squared, Dropbox, Zoom, a bunch of really successful startups. And I think you probably need to have a certain amount of scale to take something like this on. So among the things that we'd like to be able to do is to make it easy so that you don't have to get to the scale of thousands of employees before you're able to participate. Some companies that have hundreds of employees as well. But the big win, I think, is to get the largest class of companies, those companies that have tens of thousands of employees or even hundreds of thousands of employees, to really participate, because that's the only way to get scale.
Well, there's also an issue that I think Stewart mentioned at the top of the conversation, which is a really fundamental one, and that is the fact that so much wealth in our society today is created through the stock market and through tech companies, and that by giving formerly incarcerated men and women an access, an opportunity to this industry, we might actually spread the wealth in ways that can contribute to repairing some of the underlying societal issues that create such high incarceration rates in the first place. Kenyatta, when you think about what Next Chapter is doing, how critical is that piece to the overall puzzle here?
I think it's very, very important. I can just give you a personal example. So, for example, the folks that go through our program, they go from earning pennies on the dollar in an incarcerated setting to, making good money out here, and they're able to break this cycle of generational poverty that exists in a lot of the families, of people living in incarcerated settings. And so I see this as like a huge step in helping break that cycle and actually, creating an opportunity for folks to build more wealth, actually. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but that's kind of my thoughts on it.
You want me to jump in on that?
You're welcome to. I thought he nailed the answer. So it's
I think he did too. So I think
Kenyatta, you got it.
Oh, man. All right.